Equality, Diversity, Inclusion, Health Psychology podcast. My name is Dr. Miah, and I am the host for this podcast. I'm joined today by Dr. Neelam Wright, who will be sharing her insight and perspectives into the current project that we are conducting on this podcast called Equality, Diversity, Inclusion in Health Psychology. Welcome, Neelam, to the show. If you would like to start to introduce yourself about what do you do currently at the moment for our audience.
Yep, sure. Hi, everyone. I am an academic developer or a senior teaching fellow in the Centre for Higher Education Practice at the University of Southampton. And my role is essentially as a researcher developer to look at the training and the kind of interventions that we have at the university for our doctoral students and to think about things that we can do to kind of fill in gaps in training. So just looking quite holistically at the doctoral journey, and I suppose our side of the support that we offer is to really think about what we can offer in terms of skills development for researchers as they go through their doctorate, to help them not only do the best in terms of their own PhDs, but also thinking about what we could actually give them in terms of transferable skills so that when they finish their doctorate, they can really progress on to whatever career aspirations that they have. And certainly with my own role, I'm very keen to sort of add an EDI lens to that, to think about less sort of well represented people from protected characteristic backgrounds who go into doctorates, and thinking about what we can do around training and development to really kind of enhance their experiences so they get the best opportunities as well.
Thank you, Neelam. I did have a question straight away, and it's for our audience. Is like, what got you to this stage as like into your position? Like, what's that journey been like in that? So just for our audience, so they get an understanding of like, I know we were talking before, like it's not a straightforward, a linear process. So I just want you to give you the opportunity to share some of that journey about what brought you to this place.
Yeah, sure. So it certainly wasn't part of the plan, and I didn't even know a researcher development role existed. And I think a lot of people don't know about these roles in universities. From my understanding, is historically they tend to be roles that people go into via something like an administration role at the university. So I suppose for myself, the way I got into it was when I did my PhD at the University of Sussex. I happened to be given an opportunity to use a large pot of money that was available for PhD students at the university to design conferences and training to develop the skills of PhD students. And at the time, there wasn't really a role for that. And I fortunately was given an opportunity to think about doing something like this. So came together with a few doctoral students, and we put together some seminar series all around training and development skills for researchers, and conference as well. And then after that, I suppose I never really stopped trying to put together events for helping build the skills of doctoral students. And then what I wanted to do was go into film academia, because I'm a film researcher by background, and very interested in culture studies, particularly Indian cinema. But I'm sure, as many of the listeners know, trying to introduce an area of research that traditionally has not really been covered that much in film studies. Film studies tends to come from literature, very kind of at the time felt very, or possibly still is, quite Western or Eurocentric. I mean, it has expanded out, but certainly Indian cinema is not as common a topic or as popular a topic as other forms of world cinema. So I had real challenges trying to get anyone to give me a role, and often found when I went for roles, I was losing out to white men. So I had to sort of stop for a moment and think, is this really going to work? Because there was only a set window for you to be able to say, well, I've done my PhD in the last 5 years, and I want to try and get an academic post. So after a while, I started to notice that I wasn't really getting anywhere with that. So went away, took a career break, but carried on doing my own independent research because I really wanted to do research but couldn't get any support for it due to all sorts of interesting reasons to do with my my own identity, the fact that I'm a mother as well. So after that, an opportunity came up at Kingston University, which was to be a project manager for the graduate research school, which actually was a formal researcher development process, similar to what I'd done before, but was a formal role. And I was given full opportunity, full reins to basically design all sorts of interventions and training, not just for doctoral students, but for early career researchers and academics too, and really had a lot of fun with that role. And fortunately was at a university where there was a lot of inclusive curriculum work going on and a real kind of support for thinking around Black, Asian, minority, ethnic academics and researchers, and just really got into that and haven't really stopped since. So that's kind of how I got into it. It wasn't part of the plan, but it was a good role because it still allowed me to feel like I was part of the research and academic community. But with the challenges I faced in ever being selected for anything, I decided to kind of think of it differently and say, well, I've obviously had some challenges to get an academic role, but what have I learned? I've learned a lot from it. And at least with the researcher development role, if I do come across junior researchers who are having similar challenges, I might be able to advise and guide them and help them steer around it, or develop into interventions or get involved in some kind of policy making that can at least improve their journey for them, just so people are a little bit more aware of the challenges that people from slightly kind of less typical backgrounds would face. So I do think, although I stumbled into it, I think it's been worthwhile, because since then I know I have helped a lot of other researchers to kind of overcome some of the challenges, and I certainly would have benefited a lot from that kind of support earlier on. But I think a lot has moved on since then, and there is a huge group of research developers at universities that we often don't know about who are doing a lot of good work in this area.
I know, no, thank you for sharing that. And I know we'll come on to a bit later around because you already mentioned like kind of the area about representation, that you were only selected or you were only part of the minority in some parts of the application or some of the jobs that you had, and you want to help others. Why do you think that's? Do you think why do you think that's important? I suppose, like, what motivated you to think in that way to help the others? Like you're saying, between this, like, why I'm just thinking, like, the motive behind it. What's the main reason? Would you say, like, yourself, why'd you do it?
Yeah, I think it actually comes from my upbringing. So my family, one side of my family are quite Orthodox Hindus. So within, although I myself don't, I'm not fully practicing as a Hindu, in terms of the values of my culture, I think they're very much embedded in the way that I work and the kind of the aspirations I have into terms of the kind of role I want to have in my career. And certainly when I was growing up, there was a big message within my faith and my culture about charitability and about selflessness and about supporting others. And it's interesting, I hadn't quite appreciated until I'd done a lot of work around racial identities and positionality, and learned a lot about decolonization practice, that I started to realise that I have a very different approach to what I want to get out of my job and my career. But it is a very core value of mine to make sure that as I progress through my career, I am lifting other people up with me. And I think that's something that I've always been told in terms of my family and my culture, that is very important. And I think actually one of the challenges I've had is the competitive and kind of self-interested environment that you can sometimes get in research, which we are now talking about, fortunately, with the kind of the growing kind of agenda with research culture and, toxicity, and how people compete with each other to unreasonable levels where they kind of end up harming each other. And there can sometimes be a bit of a pushing people out of the way to get ahead attitude, which I find quite challenging, because that sort of I think I have demonstrated, I would hope, in the work that I've done myself, that it is actually possible for people to work more as a team and to bounce off each other and to support each other's careers, and they can sort of progress up together rather than it being everybody for themselves. I think that's not necessarily how everybody works, but certainly I would say that has allowed me to have the motivation and the interest to want to do more to help others. I'm also just naturally a very empathetic person. So I think my skill set allows me to understand challenges quite well. So when I do sit down with a postgraduate research student in a one-to-one and they talk about their challenges, I do tend to be able to kind of help them to open up, think more reflectively about what's actually getting in the way, be more honest about their experiences, and then together we sit down, we talk about how to navigate around it. And I've seen a lot of doctoral students benefiting from that and having the courage and motivation to move on. So just in terms of kind of mentoring skills, I think those come quite naturally, but a lot of it I would say comes down to my cultural identity as well, I think.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating you said that, because the other question that I had was that because we cover in our teaching, in my teaching session, about individualism and collectivism, and in this way of like to improve, say, because it's a health psychology podcast, but in terms of like health and well-being outcomes, is this important? Do you think, like to look at it from this perspective of collectivism? Because when we're talking about health and well-being, we're not talking about individuals. We are obviously, but we're talking at the bigger level of health. Health psychology looks at the population of health, just for the audience. If they're wondering what health psychology is, we look at the mass, if you like. And in this way, collectivism. Do you think that has a role to play, if you like? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's definitely a really important area of interest for me at the moment, because at Southampton I've been given more of a well-being and pastoral focus on our support for our PGRs at the moment. And what I'm trying to do is put a bit of an EDI and decolonisation lens on the well-being, to think about how else we can think about supporting our researchers beyond just inviting them to a wellbeing workshop. What else can we do? And recently, one of the ideas that we came up with, which we are going to be carrying out soon, is we were talking about the fact that, yes, we can point students to self-help guides and online 30-minute mental health self-led training sessions, but in the end it's about the environment and what can we do to ensure that as a doctoral student comes in to the university as a researcher, that they're instilled with good behaviours around ways in which they can help their own researchers around them to stay healthy in that way. And so that when they progress, they take those good behaviours and those good role modelling with them, they become early career researchers, and then they become the academics and the professors, so that the kind of attitudes change. And I think a lot of that is around moving beyond just thinking about what you need yourself and actually thinking about what you can do for your community. So one of the ways we're going to do it is I've been talking to a lot of Black academics about Ubuntu philosophy, which comes from South Africa, and that is very similar to the idea of collectivism in that it thinks about a person making sense of themselves and being able to navigate the world through other people, through their connectivity to other people. I'm not going to try and go into the full specifics of what Ubuntu philosophy is, because I'm still learning about it. But what we have agreed to do is to kind of try and encourage new incoming PGRs to think about themselves as not just an individual researcher, but as part of a community, and then to talk about well-being and pastoral care and signpost what's available, but actually ask them to think about how they're actually going to support their peers as well. And within that, we've got particular schemes in place. So, for example, a PGR mentoring program, which has training which specifically talks in a more culturally intelligent way about role modelling and thinking about people who are different for you, and watching out for your peers to see if they are struggling with something, what can you do yourself to support them, so that it becomes a support network. So we have a sort of two-layered approach. We've got the baseline support for them, which is for the individual, but actually trying to foster behaviours of people kind of seeing themselves as part of a community, and everybody seeing themselves as being responsible for everybody's health. That's definitely something that we'd like to do, but I think this is still an area that needs a lot more work done, and I'm sure within the health psychologies there's a lot of good advice that could be given there, particularly for doctoral well-being as well.
Yeah, you used an interesting term. Like, I thought, no, that was really good. Thank you so much for sharing that, Neelam. So you used an interesting term, cultural intelligence modeling or model. Could you tell us a bit more about that? What do we mean? Because I think that was really fascinating when you said that. I was thinking, I've never heard that. I've heard it in split it upwards, but not together in that sense. So what do we mean by that?
Yeah, so I was talking about it in reference to mentoring, so I can give it to you in that sense.
Yeah.
So when I originally started delivering mentoring programs for doctoral students, it tended to draw on the kind of traditional models and theories that we use that tend to come from business, largely in the western part of the world, and sometimes mentoring tends to be about commonality between the mentor and the mentee. And what I noticed was when I was running schemes, there were a lot of people who were relationships that would fall down, or people that wouldn't be as willing to work with someone because they were just too different. So, for example, people wanting to only be connected to someone within their own disciplines. So when I was at Kingston University, I learned about cultural intelligence. I think it was specifically Julia Middleton's core and flex model, which gets you to think a little bit more about your own core values and the values that are actually more flexible in yourself. And there was an activity that sort of got people to sort of reflect on that, so that when they went and engaged with people who were culturally different to them, they could navigate those differences better, and therefore they could sort of learn from each other, rather than kind of those values clashing and then causing the relationship to break down. So I tried bringing this into the mentoring training, and what I found was a lot of people started to notice that the assumptions they had made was that mentoring and role modeling only works when you're meeting someone that's exactly like you. But actually what we did was we shifted the message and said, you should expect the person that you're role modeling to have very different values to you. They may come from a different culture. So we talk about the Equality Act and the different protected characteristics and how those might be quite different to yourself, and look at case studies of what those differences look like. So, for example, if the two people are a different age, or if one person has marital relationship which is culturally different to the values of your own. So we work through that, and then through that people learn to accept and expect difference, but actually to be able to learn from it. And since we've done that, we found that people are more willing to want to be connected to people who are from different disciplines, different cultural backgrounds, because they're seeing the benefit of learning from either their mentor or their mentee. And at the end of the programs, we're seeing people coming out saying, gosh, I have learned so much from that person because they were so different from me. And actually, it wasn't a problem that I was a feminist and she was a Muslim woman, a married Muslim woman, because actually we understood what those differences were, and when we didn't agree on something, that wasn't a problem because we knew it was just because our core values were different. So we just learned from each other. Whereas before we did the cultural intelligence bit, people said, look, this is not going to work, we just don't agree on the same stuff. So there is a lot out there now, and there is training around cultural intelligence, which is got some really amazing activities that people can embed into their training to get people to think in this way. So that's effectively what I mean by it. I'm by no means an expert on it, but I certainly have started to try and think in a more culturally intelligent way and encourage others to. And I think there's a lot of work still to be done there.
Yeah, I think that in our discipline for our trainees, that needs to be really embedded in health psychology, people who are doctorate trainees, because at the end of the day, they'll be working with people, and predominantly health psychologists work with people who got health problems, and these health problems are normally indicated by the data, and the data suggests that's driven by particularly people who are from different protected characteristics. So of course, you need to know how the other lives, if you like, or how other see the world and what's important to them, isn't it? And if you don't know, or if you don't be on that journey, then how will you know when you are communicating with them, say in a hospital or at their homes or on the phone or online or in community centres, in everywhere spaces where there's health issues. So even from the point of like commissioning in public health, in local authorities, like how will you understand what a population is going through or difficulties if you don't understand who they are? And it needs to be embedded in. So the question I have around this then is, normally when you see the word culture and cultural or equality, diversity, inclusion, normally it's like at the back of the queue or in the middle somewhere, or it's seen as something optional, or it's not as seen as like front of the queue, because we first talk about people in terms of data, numbers, and then this other thing that we talk about, inclusion and cultural diversity, things like that, normally is at the back. So when trainees are trying to like acquire knowledge and information, they only got so much capacity, right? And I don't think it's because they don't care. It's just like because it's so far back, they don't see it as important. They think, well, I need to understand the data first and the health problem and the formulation. I'm just thinking, how would you support? What would you suggest, I suppose, or what are your thoughts on that? How does it? How
do you bring it to the front?
Yeah, if you like, that's a better way of putting it.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I do have something that I've been involved with that I think is quite powerful, and actually, interestingly, has actually been introduced to the NHS, I know, but perhaps not quite at the scale it could be. And this is reverse mentoring. So at the moment at the University of Southampton, I'm the project lead for quite an interesting reverse mentoring project, which is essentially taking undergraduate students, postgraduate students and junior academic staff from underrepresented backgrounds and protected characteristics and matching them as mentors to mentor senior leaders at the university. And in terms of senior leadership, I mean either professors and deans and heads of school, but also heads of the professional services side. So, for example, things like HR. And what's interesting about that is having also been involved in a reverse mentoring program at another university as a mentor to the chief operating officer at the university, so member of the executive board. What I've noticed is powerful about reverse mentoring is it absolutely provides the individual with that deep embedded insight into what culture is, because what you're doing is you're having an intimate series of conversations, difficult, honest, open conversations about what it is like to walk in the shoes of someone from that cultural background. So I think what happened, I mean, this is only 6 sessions that you would usually have with the reverse mentoring, but what we're seeing is people will come out of it so impacted on by that experience that it almost jolts them into thinking about it after that it almost changes their behavior in a way, because they've had this deep connection with someone. And I think generally with a lot of the work, some of the reasons why people can't think automatically about the cultural side of it is because they haven't been exposed to that culture. And the people who do think about it, who aren't from that culture, when I do ask them, how is it that you have this instinctual understanding, it's because they've actually taken the time to go and work or socialize with that group. So quite often, even with cultural intelligence training, one of the first things they get you to do is to think about your positionality and think about what's in your own bubble and who actually in your life you've connected with, what cultures they're from, and who you haven't connected with. So you begin to become aware of your blind spots. And certainly in my own work, because I know I'm working with students from all over the world, I do quite often spend time with people from cultural backgrounds that I know nothing about. and just invest the time in understanding their culture, whether it's understanding about their food or how their family dynamics work. And just through those kind of personal conversations, I find it's much easier to bring those sort of thoughts to the fore when you need to, if you've had those personal connections. So I do think that's kind of one thing that people might need to do, is actually think about, not just in the workplace, but even outside the workplace. Maybe when you're listening to Spotify on the weekend, are you only listening to people from your own background? Maybe if you want to understand the Black community better, you can listen to their voices a bit more. Or when you're watching TV, or you're going to the cinema, or you're connecting with someone, maybe make that extra effort. Or if you're a teacher and you're engaging with your students, maybe invest a little bit more in listening to certain viewpoints over others. And it's just doing that work of thinking about what your blind spots are culturally, and actually doing the work to actually fill that in. I mean, some people do that through travel. They actively choose to go to places where they don't know. A lot of people go to places that they know all about, but there are lots of things we can do. There are places in the UK we can go where you can actually be exposed to the communities that you don't know anything about. And I just think there is a lot to be said for that little bit of extra work done that can really make it much easier to think on the spot when you are trying to think a little bit more culturally. It can make that easier, and eventually it does become something that happens a bit quicker, that is perhaps less labour than people think it will be.
Does that mean then the person who is seeking that cultural intelligence or that knowledge, they have to have, they have to develop or have to have levels of empathy, because you are experiencing, you are being in someone else's space respectfully so you can learn, and there has to come up from a place of authenticity. You want to do it, you want to empathize, you want to learn, so it has to, I think, because when we're training like health psychologists, there's this part that we do, when they sign up, a few years ago when I had to sign up, I'm sure we had to do a health form, a fitness practice form before we had to go to the GP to get us signed off to show that are we fit to practice. And I always thought to myself, like, okay, they've got the biological like measures and stuff, have got any health problem and stuff. But I wondered, there's no psychological sort of, testing, if you like, or measures, I should say, like empathy. Like, well, should that be something that should be considered if you're going to do this type of, going and working with people, especially from different backgrounds, the role of empathy, and is there something that we should be aware of?
Absolutely. And then just going back to reverse mentoring, that's one of the key goals of it, is to develop cultural empathy. A lot of things that I've heard, senior leaders say about, their roles is sometimes you have to shut down the emotion for the role. And certainly with my own experiences of reverse mentoring, that is literally what I was told, is that I do not use emotion in my role, because in order to perform my role, I have to remove the emotion. So I wondered what that then did to empathy. There was a disagreement that perhaps emotion is not needed for empathy, but there's also a strong feeling, I think, that emotion interferes with your ability to make senior level or serious decisions. But unfortunately, I do think that emotional intelligence is important for empathy. So there is, I think, now a bit more of a shift to think about compassionate leadership and compassionate ways of working, and building that empathy back in and allowing emotion back in. So I've recently written something about the fact that, emotion and empathy isn't something that you have all the time, or you don't have at all when you're working. It's something that we just need to learn to regulate. We all need to do it. We need to know when to use it, when not to use it, how much of it to use, how little of it to use, and just kind of turn it on and off like a tap. So, and I think that's the thing that people misunderstand about it, is that if you are perhaps in your work life and you decide to switch it all off, there is a cost to that. in terms of the connection that you have with someone, maybe how much they trust you, how much you actually pick up about that person. You might miss things because you weren't looking, because obviously if you are quite emotionally intelligent, you're not just listening to what they say or looking at what they've written, you're also looking at their body language, you're looking at their facial expressions, and there's so much you can read off a person that way that can give you all this extra information. I mean, I'd certainly myself, I've had some pastoral roles with postgraduate research students, and quite often they are very frightened to talk about challenges. Like they might be very frightened to talk about the fact that they're having difficulties with their supervisors because they're worried about how that might reflect on their ability to progress, because it looks like they're complaining. But there's a lot that I can pick up off the emotions that they present, which then allows me to kind of investigate, and then for them to open up and then disclose, and then we can deal with the issue. But I wouldn't be able to do that if I didn't have the empathy and the emotional intelligence on. But I do understand that in some areas of work, there is a feeling that in order to make hard decisions and to do a job efficiently and professionally, you can't use the emotion and the empathy because it can cloud judgment. So I think there is a bit of a debate to be had about that. But I think the answer probably would be is that everybody needs to have the skill set ready, but they just need to know how to manage that so that whatever decisions or whatever they're determining about, whether it's a patient or a student, is kind of well judged.
Yeah, because you said emotions, because in our sort of my background, sometimes you can't separate out the two between emotions and empathy, because in our family circle, relatives and generational, if you do that, you're seen as cold,
Yes.
and then they disconnect with you, and then because it's in that way even if you try to explain it to them and you say no, it's like this, they still won't get it, because they're our upbringing and conditioning, if you like, I don't know how we see the world, but the emotions are very much connected to empathy. That's what makes you human. And if you separate out and you don't show any emotions, you're not human as such. And they'll just say, well, you don't care really. And then that causes disengagement, causes a bit of like distance, and they're less likely to listen to your advice, let's just say. And I just thought when you said that about the emotions and the empathy, especially for like different groups or people, South Asian, British, Bangladeshis, we have that. Like if you don't show emotions, then it can go against you, and I think that's a cultural perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Is that common?
And yeah, and it's I think there's just so much to be explored there that I think we should be talking about, because I don't think people are aware of those differences. And it's particularly interesting when you're an ethnic minority or a South Asian person within the UK, within the English environment, because obviously Britishness, Englishness, there are certain attitudes towards the way in which you show your emotions. Sometimes it's also sometimes differently nuanced if you're working class and middle class as well. So you will quite often have people from working class backgrounds saying that they notice that same kind of reservedness in the middle classes as well. And sometimes you might have people saying that they find the emotional display a little bit much. I mean, I'm from, in my family, half my family are English white and half of them are Punjabis. So and when I first got married, we had a whole discussion around the fact that my both sets of parents were absolutely wonderful with each other, but there was the whole sort of, gosh, they're a little bit cold, aren't they? Which it's just a classic sort of first reaction. But then the other side also said, gosh, they're a bit over the top, aren't they? Yeah. So it's quite really interesting. And so we, over the years, we've all had conversations in our family around this. And I've learned so much actually from my own, both sides of the family, because they are so different. They are one side are very much, brought up in England, certain kind of British values, and the others, partly from Africa, partly from India. And, it's just been wonderful that everybody's been very open to talk about their levels of emotional tolerance. And, I know that I've learned a lot about how the emotion affects each side. And certainly in my own research, so I've written about Bollywood cinema, which I don't know if the listeners have ever seen, is certainly on the emotional side, very actually expressively emotional,
Yes.
and also in terms of sound and colour. And it's there's been a lot written about Bollywood cinema being unsuccessful in the UK in comparison to other cinemas, like for example Korean cinemas, kind of more palatable, I would say, because it's just too much in the emotion, that it almost causes a kind of a feeling of repulsion for some, because it just seems ridiculous or a little bit over the top. Whereas interestingly, if you show someone who's really into Bollywood, you know, a gritty British drama, they'll just find it just numb. So there are kind of nuances to cultures, and I think a lot of it is explaining why you get culture clashes, why you get people who kind of misunderstand each other, and you sometimes get microaggressions, and you get, you know, different people just not mixing well in the workplace, or you might even get misinterpretations about patients because you're sort of misreading, even, you know, in education, teachers not understanding the parents very well because they have expressed themselves differently. So there is a lot around that going on, which is again goes back to why we do need to understand what those differences are, and maybe just the understanding of it will help us to accept it. Certainly within my own family, although it didn't necessarily change both sides, they're still who they are, they still emote the way they emote, but they really do tolerate, and well, tolerate is not even the right word, they just really accept the differences in emotion. And it's nice to see when they come together how they are true to themselves but very accommodating of each other's emotional expressions. And so it really does, that's where my hope comes from, that this is something people can do. Everybody can learn to be themselves, but to understand where the other person is coming from and to not kind of misinterpret. And obviously going back to kind of the wider work around anti-racism, I think, you know, a lot of the kind of, if you think about the kind of the very obvious microaggressions that, for example, women of colour would face, you know, a lot of it is around the tone of the way they talk, or people like seeming very aggressive because of their body language or the way they carry themselves or the choice of words they use. And I think a lot of that is emotional because people react to it because it just seems too strong to them. But to someone, say, for example, from a Caribbean background, they might say, this is just how I express myself because I'm Caribbean. You can't expect me to behave exactly, you know, I can't code switch to the way where if I lose my voice and I need to speak in this extremely reserved way, it sort of takes my authenticity away from me. So there has to be room for me to be myself and to express myself in a natural way. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done around it. And I imagine with health, it's even more interesting because obviously it impacts on the service, doesn't it?
Yeah, and you know, life expectancy, the quality of living, and if we don't, I think if we're not exposed to, or we don't expose ourselves to how people think and how people are, then you're right. We become defensive about it. We become emotional. We're thinking there's something not right because we're not used to this. So our first go-to is to do that sort of, you know, have that rational. Okay, this doesn't look this because it doesn't fit within my sort of cultural narrative. This isn't right. This doesn't belong because I have not been exposed to it. But if I had been exposed to it from a young age, and I've been very lucky in that sense to be grew up and born in a place like Luton where it's diverse, that it's when other people come across a similar type of people and they feel quite threatened by it, I always think to myself, why is that happening? And that's my own sort of learning there. Like maybe that person hasn't been exposed. There's nothing wrong with the other person. It's just maybe they've not had the same experiences that I've had, upbringing, to say, okay, this person's speaking this way, or they act in this way, or they react in this way, or that family dynamic. For example, you know, there's families that talk over one another, and that's normal. It's actually it's not like, and then you try to put everyone back in their box, and then they get defensive and they don't trust you. So normally talking over each other in a family setting, say imagine it's a health setting, you know, you go to you know, the patients in the hospital ward, and you've got the family around, and they're talking, and you're the health professional. You go in, and then you find, you know, 4 or 5 members, and they all just break all the social rules, if you like, as compared to what we have here in the UK society. Like, you might have two people waiting outside, but they'll bring the whole family in, and that's normal for them. And you try to tell them, like, no, there's only two people at a time, then they'll get very defensive with you, because in their world, like, no, we're all one unit. There's no such thing as two people, three people. Some of them will get it, some of them will
Yeah.
really get it, but other people, and you're not trying to suppress them or disrespect them, I should say, maybe because they don't have that understanding. And should they have that understanding, maybe we should also listen to their perspective too. It's not like forcing our opinion on theirs and our systems on theirs. And I know that you do some work around this area, around decolonization and making it much more accessible. And I wanted to talk a bit more about representation as the last part of the conversation. Why is representation, I suppose, important then, in that you think about in the context of what we've discussed? Why is representation then important, in the spaces for health, as health professionals? Why do you need to have people from different backgrounds in the health professionals? That's a better way of phrasing it.
Yeah, I think it's because you can only learn so much in your busy life about the differences, that actually sometimes on a day-to-day basis there are things that need interpreting, and actually the more variety you have around, the more perspectives you have on a particular situation. And I think certainly having worked in environments where people are generally from the same background, you do see very clearly the groupthink that happens. So when you are thinking about how to tackle a situation, rather than getting a number of perspectives, balancing out those perspectives, and then everybody seeing which one is clearly the strongest idea, you tend to get a very quick, like, one person thinking something and everybody else thought the same thought, and they kind of agree. That's not necessarily what always happens, but actually the amount of groupthink that does go on, and I think there's a comfort to that, because it gets you through the meeting quicker if everybody just agrees. But when we talk about diversity of thought, what we're saying is, if we really want to make sure we've got the right choice, then we shouldn't have people who think exactly the same way being the only ones to make the decisions. We need to have people who think in an alternative way. And I think just from our conversation, we've demonstrated how your cultural background can hugely impact the way that you navigate your role, the way you think, the way you problem solve, the way you emote, the way you respond to people, the way you communicate. And actually, that's quite a different skill set that you are bringing in with each different individual. So actually, if you have a group of people who all grew up in a very similar environment, communicate in a similar way, have a similar vocabulary, similar values, you're more likely to get very similar sorts of outcomes and approaches in the way that they work. If you throw into the mix someone who is completely different, and it doesn't have to be culturally different, this also goes for people who are neurodivergent, and actually you get the exact same challenges for them, they will just tackle things in a different way. And it's very refreshing to have someone when you're trying to deal with an issue and you're thinking it through, to have a few people in the room who will be able to look at the alternatives and just check your blind spots in a way. And I imagine that with kind of when you're working with patients from different backgrounds, there are just lots of bits of hidden knowledge around the context, their experience, their histories, their cultural values, their faith, that is also data that you can use to understand what they will need. And having someone who is, knowledgeable in that area, I think it should be valued. That lived experience should be valued just as much as we value researchers. We call people a professor because they're an expert in something, but actually we don't value the expertise that someone brings from their own life experience of understanding that community of people. And unfortunately, I think what we're doing too much of is thinking that someone who doesn't understand that culture, isn't exposed to that culture, and doesn't identify with that culture will be able to do the same level of work. And that I think they can support that work and they can do a lot of learning around it. But it is a gift to have someone that has the insights. And I think we need to appreciate that. I mean, admittedly, there may not be that many people around just yet, and there's a lot we need to do in the pipeline to create the opportunity in the first place to hire people who are diverse. But when we do have the opportunity, we've got to snap it up. And I think if people don't understand why, it's because they've never done it. I would encourage you to, if you are someone who hasn't worked with someone from a different cultural background, give it a try, see how they think, see how they approach things differently. And if they have an insight into the experiences of the patient, it can help you get to what you need to a lot quicker, not just in terms of getting the understanding of what the patient needs right, but actually even communicating to the patient becomes a little bit easier to do. So there is a lot there, but in terms of representation, I think unfortunately there's a lot of people saying yes, we need to have diversity, but not quite appreciating enough why we need the diversity. But there's a lot of knowledge and expertise going in the lived experience that I think we're taking for granted.
Yeah, no, I think like that's really helpful for people who might be, currently designing health programs. They'll be working multidisciplinary teams and saying, okay, if we want to design something for, say, example, for men or women or people of no gender, they have to think about the different groups of people, the intersections. So whilst they might not be from that, part of that characteristic, that might be useful for them to say, well, how do I consider them in my, intervention, for example, if I'm designing something for diabetes or, improve heart condition or improve physical activity. And I look at the data and there's this many people living here and they've got these characteristics. How do I include all of them in that sense, not exclude? And if there are exclusions, then I think it should be clear to say this intervention does not apply to this, and so it's clear. So it's about transparency. And sometimes I think like when there's, a general term, like, men, for example, well, what men are we talking about? That's, for me, that's always been a bugbear, because to say this affects the biggest killer in men is this. I'm like, really? Not for my people, or not for people that I know. The actual conditions are here. For example, type 2 diabetes is big in Bangladeshi men, for example. And it's not this. And sometimes that can be a distraction. And then, so it's almost like this whole thing about, focus on intersection, focus on representativeness. But the thing is, if you're not there, and if you don't come from that space, then who's going to say it for you? Who's going to challenge that? Who's going to, or not even challenge, but put it on the table to say, well, hang on, there's also this bit as well for these people. What are your thoughts around that, around the use of like the general sweeping, if you like, those sweeping statements, if you like, men is like this. It doesn't have to be men, it could be other characteristics too, that everyone is the same, and we're not one homogeneous group. There are intersections. And that's what I mean
absolutely. Yeah. So I suppose the example that I suppose that I've done more work in is just thinking around women in higher education and helping them with their careers. We have things like the Athena Swan Charter, which universities are very proud of being involved in. But unfortunately, I've seen examples of universities getting silver awards for an Athena Swan Charter when it was only helping white women. If I had a penny for every time I met someone who thought women just meant any woman, and if 20 people benefited and they were all women, but they were all white women, then that's fine, because women is done. We've done that. We've helped everyone. But I don't think there is an understanding of the difference between, for example, the experiences of a black woman in higher education as opposed to a white woman in higher education. When you go down that road, it is amazing to see how much evidence there is of differences of experience. That's not to say that white women don't have challenges. They absolutely do, but the challenges are very unique challenges to Black women. There are all sorts of things that they have to deal with because of the colour of their skin, because of their ethnic background, that actually others don't. And that includes myself. I know myself as a model minority, having spoken to Black women who are trying to navigate higher education, there are things they have to deal with that I do not have to deal with as a South Asian woman. There are things I get away with that they don't. So there are nuances, and I think it all explains why there are so few of them. Yet when you look at the interventions that are around thinking about women, it's not thinking in an intersectional way, and there's no requirement to, and that's where it feels a little bit box ticky, because the benefit is only going to a very particular group. And then you still have, for example, Black women who are not being seen at senior levels, but then nothing needs to be done about it, because of course we have progressed. We've now got 50% representation in this space of white women, so we have our gender diversity. But whereas for me, I would say that doesn't feel like diversity for me, because there are no women of colour in that space, and actually there are particular values that women of colour can bring to a space because of their cultural background, which intersects with their gender, which leads to certain types of, I think assets and skill sets and attitudes and behaviours that can be really, really bring added value to a team. And I think that's the danger with the kind of slightly more generalised or shortcutted approach to thinking about identities. And like you said, at the moment, I appreciate people might be at the very start of their journey with EDI work, so they might need to start in a simplistic way and just think about Black, Asian, minority, ethnic. But actually, when you get more into it, you realise actually there's a big difference between model minorities' experiences and Black experiences. And then within Black experiences, you will find that actually there is a very particular group. It could be, I know in one university, when we looked into it, it was actually specifically Black Caribbean students that were most affected by not being able to, get the support they needed in a doctorate. So, and then you can break it down even further, and you can look at things like whether some of them are carers, what kind of backgrounds they came from, whether they have disabilities, whether they belong to any other protected characteristics, and there are nuances and layers to it. So and it is possible to get better at that. But I think there is sometimes a bit of a laziness to just want to do it in a very simplistic way, and that will only get us so far. So I do think we need to, now that we've been talking about EDI for a long time, we need to now just start thinking more intersectionally about things. But I absolutely agree that certainly with men, unfortunately, I would say that one just does seem to be one of the ones we tend to generalize quite a bit in our work. So I really do hope there's going to be more work in that area to try and sort of break that down a bit more.
No, that's absolutely, because it's if you don't do it, I think it hides the real issues. And then when psychologists start thinking about why they're training, they're supposed to help and address societal problems. Well, how they're going to know about what problems people are facing if they do this generalization? Like really looking at the individual. Again, individualism is really important here, but the intersection, right? So collectivism and individualism, that's where individualism is really, really, I think, quite strong. They can come in and say, right, let's look at who is the most vulnerable in society, these groups, and who are these people, and how do we improve it for them? But we have to see it from that lens, if you like. Especially are they represented in our health services? So do we have them accessing, and are they at the same level? Have they got the equal access, equal outcomes, if you like? And I think when we start looking, when health psychologists and trainee psychologists, people are looking in this field who are training to this standard, that's when we can start to really tackle those health outcomes and reduce health inequality. That's where the importance of representation, in not just in the workforce, but also in our services, and our outcomes, has to be the focus. We have to see everywhere, because sometimes we do, even as a charity like ROM, mental health charity, without mentioning the organizations, the local authorities would come to our charity and say, we've got this big problem that, here's our population for the town, but half of them are not accessing our services according to our data. Can you help us improve access? And normally I would say, well, there's a reason why they're probably not coming. And you already have that data, you have the intelligence, and the literature's out there. You just haven't sat down and thought about it, deep enough. Like, people have written about this, about access, and so we really have to start, pause and then go back and say, why isn't that coming? Because people have done the intelligence gathering about the barriers. It's because our systems are not representing that population. So we talked about empathy, cultural intelligence, all those things. So if they're not embedded in our health services, why would they turn up? If something wasn't fitting for me, I wouldn't turn up. That's just logic. Like, that's cognitive reasoning, right? If something doesn't fit, I wouldn't try that shoe on. It's just the shoe doesn't fit. There's nothing complex about it. And they have the intelligence. So I just wanted to give you, I know we're coming to the end of the podcast, just give you a chance to have final thoughts, final message, or come back to what I've said. And then once you stop talking, I'll stop recording. But before you do, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Neelam, for your time and your energy. I know it takes a lot for you to go, for people to go into their deep thoughts and connect the dots, if you like, for our audience. So thank you so much for formulating that I know we've been planning this for some weeks. But if anyone wants to reach out to you, feel free to leave any contact details. I'll put it into the description for our listeners if they want to reach out to him and hear more from you. But yeah, for now, the microphone is over to you. And like I said, when you stop talking, I'll stop recording.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Yes, I'm very happy to be contacted, particularly if anybody would like to know more about my approaches to inclusive training. I have certainly started to move towards helping people to think about the training that they offer and how it can be made kind of more EDI literate, to think about the audiences that are coming to benefit from that training, as well as any questions around doctoral training specifically. But I guess if I was going to give a message to the audience, because I appreciate sometimes this can be a bit of a cognitive load to think about all of this, and we're all very busy in our lives. So I think our challenge is to get better at distilling what we want to say so that people can actually apply it in a practical and easier way in their busy lives, which is certainly something I will try and do as the years go on. But I guess a last bit of thing I wanted to say was just a plea to encourage the listeners to think about, when you do go for any professional development training yourself, or when you deliver the training, if you go and join someone else's training, have a look at it and have a think about what's going on in that space. Think about what kind of humour they're using, whether it's a very British or English type of humour, whether they're using any in-jokes, and whether everybody in the room would understand those in-jokes, particularly those who might be from other countries. Think about whose names they can pronounce, whose they can't. Think about the accents in the room. Are the people with the accents being given the opportunity to speak? Whose voice is being elevated in the room? Is there any assumptions about the cultural and historical knowledge of the people who are there? What about the case studies that you're given? Are those case studies biased? Are there any stereotypes in there? Have they thought inclusively about them, the positions and the identities of the characters in the case study? Are there any references that are made, or any metaphors or sayings that people won't catch because they're from a different cultural background? These are all things that you might start to spot if you become a little bit more, have a more critical eye to the training. And if you are someone who is a practitioner who delivers any form of training, I would encourage you to get more to embed a little bit more interactivity in your training. Training doesn't have to be lecture style format, because just that little bit of interactivity, what it does is it allows people to bring in their own voices in, and you can learn something from the people that you're training to, which then can help you to reshape and improve your own training design. But do have a look at decolonisation approaches, because there are lots of types of ways in which you can critique your own training and make sure that it speaks better to Black, Asian, minority ethnic people. But like I said, I'm happy for people to reach out if they want to learn a little bit more about that. And I have provided a link to some resources for a decolonising training project I did last year, which has a very useful checklist that someone can use when they're evaluating their training in that way.